sir. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be here, so thank you. And thank you for staying. I know this has been a long day, a very interesting day. And I'm happy to be the last piece before you all get to go home and have a nice dinner. Part of the reason I also said to come here is because actually my grandmother's family was from here. And so it's a little bit of me tracing my roots. Thank you. So really meaningful for me. The organizers, when they asked me to do this, they said, we need you to be inspiring at the end. And I said, good, let me talk about setbacks and failures in negotiation. And they said, if you think you can be inspiring with that, go for it. So this comes from a book that I published a few months ago. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to take you through the framework very briefly. If you're interested, there are some books downstairs. I'm happy to sign some copies for you if you're so disposed. But I want to start with a story related to failure. So the story actually occurred back in the 1980s, which is a long time ago, in a coal mine in Kentucky, which is very far from here, obviously. And a colleague of mine was asked to go and mediate, try to help with the situation, because there was a strike that was looming. And there was a real worry that it might lead to a national strike. It was so bad that the management and the union wouldn't sit down together. So he and another colleague went back and forth to try to get the parties to agree. They ultimately did get the parties to agree, but there was a problem, which was that the miners had to approve the deal. And they did not do much work on what the miners really wanted. The representatives thought they knew, but actually they didn't know very well. So it ended in a stalemate and kind of a collapse of the process. Eventually, months later, they were able to kind of come back to the table and figure it out. But I want to highlight this because the person that was involved in this is a close colleague of mine named William Ury, who many of you may have heard of. He wrote a book called Getting to Yes. If you haven't read Getting to Yes, please read it. It changed the landscape of negotiation. Now, the reason I share this story is because William is perhaps the best negotiator that I have ever met. And I think most people would say that. And he failed. And the thing is, failure is part of the negotiation landscape. And part of the reason that I wrote this book is because when I started to look around, I didn't see much about this. And what was actually interesting is when I started to talk to publishers, I said, I have this idea about writing a book about failure in negotiation. They said, that's interesting. We don't publish about failure. And I said, really? Why? And they said, because people don't want to read about failure. I said, really? And they said, yeah. So interestingly enough, I failed for a couple of times to find a publisher until I found a smaller publisher who called me the next day that I sent in the proposal. And he said, I'm calling you because I get 15 proposals a month for books on negotiation, and nobody is writing about this. And I said, good, because I think there's something to say here. And anybody that's done any negotiating at all has failed, right? I'm not telling you anything that's new. But the problem is, when we don't talk about it, people think they're not good negotiators. And that's a problem. So 4 years ago, I wrote another book. It was called The Book of Real World Negotiations. It was 25 cases of successful negotiations, okay? And there was a woman who approached me and said, I read your book and I really, really liked it, but I have a question for you. I said, sure, what's the question? She said, why'd you write about successes? I said, I don't know, I think people would want to read about successes. And she said, yes, but I remember my failures far more. And would you consider doing something? And I thought, interesting, sure, let me think about it. And then one of my students shortly thereafter said, what are you working on now? And I said, I'm thinking about a book on failure. And what do you do with it? How do you cope with it? And she goes, "Thank goodness." And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And she said, "Because everything we read in the program is really interesting, but it's all about successes. And if we don't succeed all the time, we think we should just quit." And I said, "If that's what we're teaching you, then we're not doing this well. We're actually doing you a disservice." Because I've never met anybody who hasn't failed in negotiation. And so I wanted to sort of humanize the process and say, this is going to happen to you. The question is, what are you going to do with it, right? And the goal, and here's where I hope this is inspirational, is not that we're just talking about setbacks and failures. We're talking about how do you become a great negotiator as a result. And there's only one way, which is to genuinely learn from it. So do you all know the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears? I think you do, right? Is that a common tale? Okay, good. So from my point of view, and the more research I did to this and the more I talked to negotiators, there are three responses to failure and significant setbacks when they happen. The first one is what I would call the too hot response. So that response is where we blame everybody else and we rationalize our behavior. If you blame other people and rationalize your behavior, guess what you're not doing? You're not learning. Right? So that's too hot. We don't want to do that. That's not a good response to failure. Okay? The second response, which is too cold, is you experience a tremendous amount of anxiety about negotiation. Right? You never really want to do it again, or if you do it again, you're feeling very anxious. You're remembering that experience, and you carry that experience forward. Again, really hard to learn when that's the case. So the just right approach is, how do we figure out how to learn from what just transpired? And it's not easy because it says a lot about us and about the challenges that we have and the weaknesses that we have. So let me explain a little bit more about that. So in the book, I talk about 7 kinds of failure. And the reason I do that is I want you to become aware of the fact that these are the ways that you can fail, right? And so when you're aware, a lot of people tell me that when they go through my trainings, they're useful because they've become much more aware of these concepts. Now the first part of learning is being aware of what are the potential problems and challenges I could run into. So I'm going to just share with you a couple different kinds. I'm not going to talk about all 7, but just so that you get an idea of the kinds of failures or what I would consider a failure in negotiation. And by the way, for me, I define failure as not meeting your objective in a negotiation, okay? All right, so the first one is something that I call slipping through the fingers failure. And that means that a potential deal was right there. It made sense for you and the other person, and yet somehow you didn't get there. And there are a lot of these kinds of deals that fall apart much of the time because of a personality thing. The intangible aspects of people being insulted or frustrated or whatever it might be and never talking about it. So that's the first kind. The second kind is the what were you thinking failure. And those are where people agree to things that are worse than their alternative or their best alternative to a negotiated agreement. There's a lot of times people have in their heads that the goal of negotiation is agreement. It's actually not. And it was interesting to watch the simulation because I think as the clock was ticking, people are saying we got to reach an agreement. It's called agreement bias. The goal of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. If you don't believe that you're doing that through an agreement, you shouldn't agree. A lot of times people sort of miss that idea. And so the what were you thinking failure is where you agree to something that's clearly worse than your BATNA, and you shouldn't. Okay? The third one is a penny wise and pound foolish failure. So there's a concept called penny wise and pound foolish, which means that you take a short-term gain instead of playing the long term. Now, when I do trainings with companies and governments, et cetera, I often ask them, how many of your negotiations are one-offs? So you sit down once, you'll never see this person again. versus negotiating with the same people over and over again. And usually it's about 10 to 15% are one-time negotiations, and 85 to 90% are with the same people or the same companies or the same governments over and over. And so in those kinds of negotiations where the relationship matters, if you take a short-term gain at the expense of the long-term relationship, you damage the relationship, that's a failure. Most people don't think about it, but to me it is, because what should happen when you have a good relationship is that your agreements and your ability to negotiate should get better. Your deals should go from good to great because you're sharing information, which is the key to negotiation. Okay? So just a few examples. And by the way, we also want to know what's the magnitude of this failure? How bad was it? Can we get back to the table, or is this done? Right? So I offer in the book like 4 steps there, or 4 kinds of magnitudes. So there's a question that I kept coming back to as I was working on this. I'm like, why is it that people don't learn about failure? Like, why don't we learn from this? What's the problem? It turns out the problem is us and what's going on in our mind. So, as I mentioned before, blame and rationalization blocks our ability to learn anything. But so do other biases. There are a tremendous amount of biases that we're subject to on a daily basis that most of us have no idea about, that impact our decision making and cause us to not want to examine our own behavior. And so, the self-serving bias is an ability to try to essentially protect your reputation at all costs, and that we view the negotiation through that lens. And we also have, there are many others. If you look around the world today, when we look at a negotiation and we say, well, what's going on there? There's a concept called entrapment. I would actually say that this global tariff war that exists is being aided by this bias called entrapment, which is that once we start down a course of action and we start investing not only money, but our reputation in something, it becomes very hard to turn course, especially when it makes sense to, right? If we keep looking at these tariffs that go up and up and up, somebody's thinking, how do we get out of this? And other people are saying, I'm not getting out of this because I have too much invested now. Right? That happens to us a lot when it comes to these failures. And then lastly, we have developed something called heuristics. So heuristics are mental shortcuts that we use on a daily basis to get through life. And sometimes they can be really helpful, and other times they're not. And in one sense, one heuristic that we use a lot in negotiation is that we've learned a way to negotiate, wherever you learned it, however you learned it. And we try to apply that to a lot of our negotiations without actually thinking, does it make sense here or not? So I'll get back to that in a minute, because it's a very important reason why we're not really doing this very well. So I'm going to just share the 5 steps in the book so that you get an idea of what this looks like. Obviously, I'm not going to go into much detail because I don't have enough time. But let me just begin down that road, okay? So the first challenge that we have to confront is that we actually failed, or that we experienced a serious setback. And we have to accept it, because that kind of thing can be rather painful. And we might not want to admit it, but it's the truth, right? And so I think this quote, for me, typifies what we go through with this, which is that accepting failures with a positive frame of mind is the first step in your learning curve. Too often, we're blocked by that. We don't want to admit we failed because of our reputation and other kinds of things that might get in the way. But it's a little bit, the analogy that I like to use is, if you don't accept this and manage it from an emotional point of view, it's a little bit like, when your sink is blocked up and nothing's getting through. That's what happens here. Nothing gets through. You can't learn until you say, that really stinks. Like, I really wanted this to happen, and it didn't happen. And now what do I do, right? Until you say, I'm really disappointed by this, and I have to cope with that. In the book, I talk about it almost like as grieving, right? Then when we lose something, and when we go into our negotiations, we're often negotiating about things that we really care about. And so it's going to be natural that we're going to feel the sting of not getting where we want to go. So the very first part of this is we've got to cope with that, right? The second step is analysis. So what I see a lot is that people dive right in to try to deal with a problem without really analyzing what's going on or understanding what happened. So when you analyze something, particularly in this case, there's two ways to do it. There's an analogy of the forest and the trees, okay? So the forest is the big picture. So for example, those 7 different kinds of failures, where does mine fall in here? Right? And then how bad was it? But then the trees are all about getting into the details. So in many negotiations that experience a serious setback or a failure, you can kind of trace it back to 1 or 2 interactions where something went really badly. And someone did something, you reacted and you responded, and from there it all fell apart, right? So you want to try to say to yourself, where did this go wrong? Where did I fail? And that analysis is really, really important, because without it, we can't figure out, can we still get back to the table? And if so, what do I need to do to change? So the third step, and this is for me one of the more important ones, is learning lessons from our failures. And the problem is this. So when I will go to trainings and talk to people and they'll say, I had a negotiation that didn't go well. They said, boy, was that a really good lesson. And I say, well, what'd you learn? And usually they haven't really given it a lot of thought. And in fact, what they're doing is they're applying the wrong lesson to what happened. And as a result, it's going to cause them to go down the wrong road again. And when I say that, the quote by John Maxwell, to me, is really important. A lot of times people will say, experience is a great teacher. John Maxwell said, experience is not the best teacher. Evaluated experience is. And that means that you really take time to say, what happened here? Right? And most of us have a core negotiation approach that we use for all our negotiations. And that's a big problem, because negotiations can be really different. There's a professor at the University of Maryland named Carolyn Bartol who had a quote that I love that I included in the book. She said, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. Right? And what she was clearly getting at was negotiations have similar patterns, but they're each unique entities that have different dynamics and different kinds of things that are going on. And so we think about learning at behavioral level, right, like tactics and things like that, but we also think about learning at a subconscious level. And if you've ever, however you learn to negotiate, that's deep in your mind without you really realizing it. And it can be taking you down the wrong road. So one of the things that I really try to work with people on is I want you to look really hard at the similarities between this negotiation and maybe your next one, and can you really apply lessons from one to the other? Because I see often people actually applying the wrong lesson. They're not really thinking deeply. And I'll say, well, is this a one-off versus a long-term negotiation? Are there multiple parties? Are there different cultures in one negotiation and not in another? There's so many dimensions that people have talked about today that impact your transferring of these lessons from one to another. So it's really important to learn the right lesson, not just any lesson. And that ultimately leads to this step, which I think is fundamental to this process, which is actively unlearning certain notions that we think are helpful in negotiation. So much of the time, the things that lead us to failure end up being our weaknesses. We all have weaknesses. None of us are good at everything in negotiation, right? So the question is, and I often ask people, tell me the pillars of your negotiation approach. When you think about this, what's the foundation? What are the core things that you do, right? And how did you learn those? I was talking to a woman the other day outside the gym, and we started discussing negotiation, and she said, "Oh, I negotiate a lot." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, the best negotiations are when everybody leaves the table a little unhappy." And I said, "Why do you think that?" And she said, she kind of paused for a minute, and she goes, "Well, my boss, who I really respect, he used to say that all the time." And I said, do you think it makes sense?" She said, "Well, by your question, I'm guessing it doesn't." And I said, "You're right, it doesn't. Because if that's your mindset, where are you ending up? Where are you heading? Where are you looking? You're looking for, what do I have to give up?" As an aside note, I am not a big fan of compromise in negotiation. Most people are like, "Wait a minute, isn't that what you do in negotiation?" No, it's not. It's actually not. It's a kind of a lazy way to negotiate, and it's an expedient way. It's an easy way. When people run into problems in negotiation, the first thing they say is, "Well, let's compromise and split the difference." I'm like, wait a minute, you don't even know whether we need to do that or not. So I've written about this because I think it's really important to think through, what should I compromise on and what shouldn't I? You should never compromise on your core objective in negotiation. You're better walking away. Right? There are places where things are maybe less valuable, less important. You can let those things go. But negotiation, as we've been talking about, is really about getting to these underlying interests. Because when you do, you find all kinds of solutions. And compromise is not necessary. That other book I told you about that I wrote 4 years ago, it's 25 cases and there's almost no compromise in there. Because people kept getting down to these underlying interests and used creative problem solving. So, for example, in the book I talk about the old way of thinking about negotiation is all about compromise. But the new way for me is much more about replacing that mindset with creative problem solving and saying, let's really work a problem. The people that I've worked with over the course of my career, they're resilient and persistent. If they don't find a solution, they flip the problem 6 different ways till they find it. When people tell me they've negotiated, I say, "What did you do?" "Well, I made an offer. They didn't like it. They made an offer. I didn't like it." And that was that. There was no way forward. I was like, you didn't negotiate. Get back there and sit down and stay there till you figure this out. Because you can figure it out if you get to those underlying interests. So I would encourage you to think, what are those things that are the core of my negotiation approach? And are they helping me still? Or are they leading me astray? And how did I even learn these things? For a lot of people, it drives me crazy. Like in the United States, I'm like, how'd you learn that? Like, oh, I read it in the newspaper. I'm like, no, that's not how you learn about negotiation. Because what the media tells you about negotiation is almost always wrong. So again, examine yourself. And this is, as you notice, that this process is very much about you. And my colleague William, who I mentioned before, he's very famous for writing Getting to Yes. He wrote another book that I think was more impactful called Getting to Yes with Yourself. And he says in the book, the hardest negotiator much of the time is the person staring you back in the mirror. So something to think about. So the last step is, okay, so I've really kind of examined this. I've thought about what the right lessons are. I've learned maybe there's some things that I do in negotiation that aren't helping me. Right, so how do I now go back to the table? Can I get back to the table? If this was a setback, right, how do I restart negotiations? And if it was a failure, how do I learn so I don't do this again? Right? Again, all of it comes back to how do we become the best negotiators we can be, which, by the way, is a journey. It's not a destination. It's not, okay? I've been doing this a really long time, as Keld and other people have, and we're still always learning. So if it's a setback, okay, and the idea is that you can get back to the table, then you need to knock on the door first. Sometimes people say, well, what if the other negotiator is a pain in the neck? And they were rude and they were all these kinds of things. Like, okay, but they're not going to knock on the door because most people haven't been trained and learned about negotiation, so they're going to remain stubborn. And I look at the example of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison. And when he got out, he called Frederick de Klerk. And he said, we need to negotiate this. And somebody said to him, you were in prison for 27 years. Why would you do that? Like, why didn't you let them come to you? And he said, someone has to knock on the door first. So even if you've been aggrieved or mistreated, do it. Okay? It's about achieving your objective. Then you have to start with them, right? And say, so this didn't work. So what was I missing? What didn't I understand about that previous process? What can I learn from it? And what went wrong? For example, a lot of times when we try to persuade other people in negotiation and it doesn't work, we took an approach maybe that was very data-driven or logical. And maybe the concern and the challenge they had was actually emotional, right? It would have caused them embarrassment or whatever it might be. So what did we miss there? And then if you failed, how do you take that unlearning seriously? For me, it's a really challenging aspect of saying, what do I think I know about negotiation that might really be wrong or might be leading me astray? It's hard because it means that you have to change some of what you're doing, right? And there are a lot of difficult realms that people struggle with in negotiation. Uncertainty is one of them, right? And it's part of the process because we're not in control of everything in negotiation. What we're in control of is how we react and respond and how we deal with uncertain situations. Most people's perspective is, tell me yes, tell me no, tell me something. I don't like sitting with this uncertainty. But if you can learn that this is part of the process and I've got to figure that out, then it really helps you, as does adaptability and flexibility. If somebody would say to me, what do you think is the most important core skill for a negotiator, I would say adaptability and flexibility, because you're always working with incomplete information. So you have to take things in and say, I didn't even know this was part of the negotiation, so what do I do with it now? Which means you have to adapt, and you have to have a flexible mindset when you do this. Right? And I will sort of leave you with this thought about this notion of kintsugi. Has anybody ever heard of kintsugi before? So kintsugi is the Japanese art form of fixing broken things, but in a sort of therapeutic kind of way. So as you can see, there's a broken vase, right? The broken vase was not put back together in a way where you can't see the breaks. In fact, it's done exactly to demonstrate and to show the breaks with precious metals. And what it does is it highlights the fact that there are imperfections in the world. And as negotiators, we're going to be imperfect. And can we own these things? Can we wear them more proudly as a result of having gone through something difficult and come out the other side and really learned something? And I think you can. And the more that I talk to people about this, the more people come up to me and say, thank you for talking about this, because I've struggled with this or failures or challenges, and nobody ever told me it was okay to deal with it. And I'm like, it is. And it's a critical part of how you grow as a negotiator. You grow from your successes, and nobody sets out to fail. But I would guarantee if I asked you, tell me a negotiation story that was really impactful, most of you would tell me something that didn't go well, right? Because that's how life works. So let me leave you with this idea. There's American football, which is not that big over here, I understand, a coach named Nick Saban, who was the winningest coach in college football. And he has this quote that I love, and he says, never waste a good failure. And he uses it with his players all the time to say, you failed. What did you really learn? Because you're going to be a better player if you really grasp this and work with it and own it. And so I think if we can move in that direction and say, okay, this isn't what I wanted, but how do I not waste this experience? So, thank you.
Kągi, jau mes beveik 7 valandas ir vis dar yra žmonių, tai nuoširdžiai ačiū Jums. Atsiprašom, kad užvėlavom, bet taip jau šiandien mums nutiko. Laimonai.
Ačiū tau, Gražvydai, už viską, buvo malonu. Mažiausiai, super. Tai va, tai ačiū visiems, kurie sudalyvavot, jo diena buvo ilga, matot ir čia ačiū parašyta, daugiau niekas neveikia. Tai su ta mintim pasakysiu tik tai tiek. Patiko šiandien derybų simulacija, kurie buvo? Tai žinokit, gegužės 9 dieną mes tokias turėsim 7, ar ne, per vieną dieną derybų lygos finale. Tai vat kviečiu visus prisijungti, ten kartu suformuosim daugiau derybų kultūros Lietuvoje. Ir paskutinis dalykas, ką noriu aš pasakyti, Gražvydas, matau, irgi kažką tai ruošia, kad mes turim datą 26 metų konferencijai, kuri bus, sakiau ar ne, kada? Kitų metų balandžio 16 dieną. Tai va, jūs be abejo visi gausite informaciją apie tai. Beje, mes turim pagrindinį pranešėją, kuris ten bus, ir aš jums dabar jo nepasakysiu. Tai va, sekite naujienas, iš manęs viskas. Gražvydai, jeigu turi kažką.
Tai aš nenoriu jūsų daugiau užlaikyti. Aš nuoširdžiai sakau ačiū Jums ir susitikim balandžio 16 dieną po metų.
Ačiū ir iki.